December 1942, a gray morning settles over a rain-slick railway yard outside Tokyo. Japanese officers stand beside a captured American Sherman tank, its steel hull still scorched from the Solomon Islands. Steam hisses from the cold air vents of the inspection depot as engineers run their hands across the machine's welded seams. They whisper to each other, not about its gun or armor, but about the plates stamped on the interior. Detroit Tank Arsenal. The inscription puzzles them. Detroit, the same city they knew for cars. Yet reports claim thousands of these tanks roll off American lines every month. Some officers laugh it off. Others fall silent. They've seen the photographic intelligence, endless columns of vehicles on American assembly lines stretching into the horizon. To them, it seems impossible. How could any nation build so much so fast? That question, born in the stunned silence of a Tokyo warehouse, would come to define the industrial story of the Second World War. And to understand it, we must go back to the world before that inscription meant anything. Before the storm of global war, the United States was not yet a fortress of tanks and aircraft. It was a nation of cars, refrigerators, and radios, a country still emerging from the scars of the Great Depression. The factories of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh had been built for commerce, not combat. Yet, hidden in those production lines lay a sleeping industrial power unlike any in history. In 1939, as Europe burned, America's army possessed fewer than 500 modern tanks. Most were light models, relics of interwar experimentation. The armored divisions that would one day storm Normandy existed only on paper. The U.S. Army's focus remained on infantry, cavalry, and coastal defense. Isolationism still ruled politics. To most Americans, the wars in Asia and Europe felt like distant storms over someone else's sea. But the tide was shifting. Across the Pacific, Japan had invaded China and built an empire stretching thousands of miles. Its leaders dreamed of a greater East Asia prosperity sphere powered by conquest and self-sufficiency. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler's mechanized blitzkrieg shattered Poland and France with terrifying speed. Tanks, once experimental, had become the weapon of the age. By 1940, the world understood wars would be won not just by soldiers, but by steel. When France fell in June 1940, Washington watched in disbelief. The speed of collapse, 6 weeks, convinced American planners that the next war would demand machines, not manpower alone. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy. Before it even existed, that phrase would become the nation's creed. The U.S. War Department began quietly mapping an industrial revolution of its own. The problem: America lacked both the weapons and the production methods for them. Factories that once built cars for middle-class families needed to be converted into plants capable of forging tank hulls, aircraft frames, and artillery barrels. It was a transformation without precedent. To achieve it, Washington turned to industry's giants. Henry Ford, whose assembly lines had revolutionized automobiles, was approached to do the same for tanks. General Motors, Chrysler, and other automakers received government contracts to design and mass produce war vehicles. Engineers tore down the walls between military and civilian industry. At the same time, the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 began mobilizing manpower, the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. Factories began hiring, expanding, training. Women and minorities, long excluded from the industrial core, would soon fill the lines. Still, in those early months, skepticism persisted. How could consumer factories truly become engines of war? Could the skills that built sedans now forge armored beasts capable of fighting across continents? The answer came through planning, meticulous, mathematical, and visionary. By late 1940, the government formed the Office of Production Management, followed by the War Production Board. Every rivet bolt and steel sheet became part of a national calculus. Engineers learned to redesign weapons not just for performance, but for mass manufacture. Tanks like the M3 Lee and later the M4 Sherman were born from this philosophy. They were not the heaviest or most advanced, but they could be built fast, repaired easily, and shipped anywhere. America's strategy became one of scale, to outproduce rather than outdesign. Meanwhile, Japan's empire, though vast, lacked the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged war. Its factories were limited by geography, resources, and infrastructure. Tokyo's leaders believed the war would be decided quickly, before America's full potential could awaken. They were wrong. When Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they did more than strike battleships. They unleashed the might of a nation capable of turning every factory, farm, and forge into an engine of war. Within months, blueprints spread across the country. Car plants were stripped and retooled. Steel foundries ran day and night. The hum of American industry grew into a roar that no enemy could silence. And as the first Shermans rolled out of Detroit, they carried not just armor and guns, but the proof that the United States had entered the war with something far greater than weapons, an industrial machine unmatched in human history. Those first tanks were only the beginning, symbols of a transformation that would soon shock the world and the soldiers who faced it. In the months following Pearl Harbor, America's industrial map changed faster than any in modern history. Entire cities became extensions of the war effort. Detroit, already the heartbeat of automobile production, earned a new name, the Arsenal of Democracy. From its sprawling factories would come not only tanks, but trucks, jeeps, and aircraft engines that powered every front of the war. At the center of this transformation stood one colossal symbol, the Detroit Tank Arsenal. Conceived by the War Department and designed by Chrysler, it rose from farmland in Warren, Michigan in 1941. Within a year, it was producing hundreds of tanks a month. By 1943, thousands. The plant stretched over 1 million square feet, with rail lines running straight into its assembly bays. Tanks emerged in endless lines, painted olive drab, each carrying the stamped serials that would one day shock those Japanese officers in Tokyo. The numbers defied belief. In 1940, the United States built fewer than 400 tanks. By 1942, that figure surpassed 24,000. By the end of 1943, production peaked at over 29,000 tanks per year, nearly 500 a month. Some weeks, over 600 rolled out of American factories, and tanks were only part of the story. Aircraft plants turned out 96,000 planes in 1944 alone, from bombers to fighters. Shipyards launched thousands of Liberty ships, one every few days, built from prefabricated sections that made construction almost mechanical. Every gun, jeep, and helmet became a symbol of industrial rhythm. Steel transformed into strategy. The logistics behind this miracle were staggering. Rail networks were expanded, highways converted for military transport, and new plants built near rivers for rapid shipment. America's geography, vast, resource-rich, and safe from bombing, became an advantage no Axis power could match. Government coordination played a crucial role. The War Production Board rationed materials, controlled priorities, and directed resources where they mattered most. Aluminum, copper, and rubber were diverted from civilian life. Tires disappeared from store shelves. New cars were no longer produced for consumers. Everything flowed toward the front. It wasn't just corporations. Every American household became a contributor. Families collected scrap metal, rubber, and cooking grease for recycling. Factories ran 24 hours a day, powered by rotating shifts of men and women. Posters declared, "Do the job HE left behind," and they did. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, not as a temporary measure, but as the backbone of wartime production. Rosie the Riveter became more than a symbol. She was a statistical force. By 1943, nearly 1/3 of all U.S. factory workers were women. African Americans and immigrants filled new roles as the nation broke its own industrial barriers out of necessity. The results stunned both allies and enemies. British observers visiting Detroit in 1943 reported seeing rows of Sherman tanks lined up as far as the eye could see. Soviet officers receiving U.S. Lend-Lease vehicles described the shipments as rivers of steel. Even German intelligence struggled to comprehend the numbers, underestimating U.S. capacity by millions of tons of output. Japan's military attachés sent back reports warning of America's accelerating mobilization, but by then it was too late. Their empire relied on limited industrial bases, concentrated around Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo, and lacked the oil, steel, and raw materials to compete. Their shipyards could not replace losses. Their tank production in 1943 amounted to barely 2% of America's. This imbalance would soon define the Pacific War. For every Japanese tank destroyed in New Guinea or the Philippines, several American replacements were already crossing the Pacific. Every destroyed plane or lost ship was replaced faster than it could be sunk. The shock came not from America's wealth, but its ability to convert that wealth into coordinated motion. The industrial gears meshed with military planning. War fought through blueprints and conveyor belts. By 1943, the question was no longer whether the United States could outproduce its enemies. It was how that production would be wielded. On the battlefields where Japanese soldiers would witness its consequences firsthand. And soon they would. From the smoking jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, those stamped tank plates and factory markings would become more than curiosities. They would become omens. Proof that the war Japan began was one it could no longer hope to win. The war effort was not fought only on battlefields. It was fought on factory floors, Inside the Detroit tank arsenal, men and women stood shoulder to shoulder beneath blinding lights and the ceaseless clang of steel. Sparks burst from welders' torches as the smell of oil and hot metal filled the air. Every turn of the wrench, every rivet driven, carried the weight of soldiers who would depend on those machines thousands of miles away. Most of the workers were not engineers or veterans. They were mothers, mechanics and machinists who had never seen a tank before 1941. Yet they learned fast. Chrysler engineers broke down complex military blueprints into simple, repeatable tasks. Assembly lines replaced craftsmanship with precision. The average worker could build a component without ever seeing the finished vehicle, a testament to a system designed for scale. They worked through winters, rationing and loss. Many had brothers or sons already overseas. To them, every tank completed was a lifeline, a promise that those they loved might stand a better chance. Across America, factory morale posters declared, "The faster you work, the sooner they'll come home." It wasn't propaganda, it was purpose. By 1944, over 18 million Americans were directly employed in war production. It was the greatest workforce mobilization in history. Each person became a silent soldier in a war of endurance, proving that courage could be measured not only in combat, but in labor. The workers' determination forged a bond between home and front, steel and soul. And that human power, multiplied millions of times, became the true engine of the arsenal of democracy. Traditional military wisdom once prized superiority of design, the strongest armor, the longest gun, the fastest machine. But the United States redefined the equation. Its weapon was quantity. The M4 Sherman tank exemplified this philosophy. It was not invincible, far from it. Against German Tigers or Japanese fortifications, it often faced disadvantages. But where one Sherman fell, 3 more took its place. Commanders learned that overwhelming numbers could achieve what singular brilliance could not. In Europe, this doctrine turned battlefields into logistical triumphs. The Allies could afford to advance relentlessly because their supply lines were endless. Damaged tanks were repaired or replaced within days. In the Pacific, the same principle applied through amphibious warfare. Fleets of landing craft, bulldozers, and tanks arriving in wave after wave. Japanese commanders, trained to prize individual valor and tactical finesse, could scarcely comprehend this model. At Guadalcanal, reports described an unending procession of enemy ships and machines. By 1944, Imperial Army staff officers acknowledged that American forces fought as an extension of their industry. Quantity became a strategy in itself, not wasteful, but calculated. Every tank, truck, and crate of ammunition represented a synchronized effort spanning thousands of miles. Where Axis supply chains strained under bombing or blockade, American forces drew from warehouses stacked to the ceilings. In short, the U.S. military turned manufacturing into maneuver. Its soldiers fought with the confidence that replacements would always come. Its generals planned knowing logistics, not luck, would decide the outcome. And behind that unstoppable rhythm stood the assembly lines, still thundering back home. The transformation from automobile to tank production was not just industrial, it was scientific. America's genius lay in standardization. Before the war, tank production in Europe followed traditional craftsmanship. Factories built limited batches with unique parts, requiring skilled labor and slow assembly. The U.S. changed that overnight. Engineers redesigned tanks for efficiency, creating interchangeable components across factories. Bolts, wheels, guns, all could be swapped between models and manufacturers. This revolution made mass repair and deployment possible. A damaged Sherman in the jungles of Burma could be fixed with parts shipped from Michigan. Tank crews joked that their vehicles were built like Ford's, and in many ways they were. Chrysler's production model, inspired by Ford's assembly line logic, divided tank building into thousands of repeatable tasks. At its peak, the Detroit arsenal produced one complete tank every 55 minutes. Subcontractors from every corner of the nation supplied components: steel from Pennsylvania, optics from Massachusetts, engines from Illinois. Technology also extended to testing. The Army Ordnance Department established rigorous inspection systems, ensuring quality without halting speed. Statistical control, a concept still young, was perfected during these years. This approach created what historians later called the industrial organism, a living network of factories, trains, and workers moving in mechanical harmony. Every gear, every conveyor belt played a part in a single coordinated heartbeat. It was technology not just of machines, but of organization, a system capable of producing miracles on schedule. And in time, those miracles would roll ashore under Pacific suns, where the enemy would see not design perfection, but industrial inevitability. The clang of hammers and the rhythm of conveyors were not just sounds of production. They were the pulse of strategy, innovation, and humanity merged into one. Each rivet and bolt built not only machines, but momentum. Momentum that was about to meet the enemy in the crucible of war. The mobilization of American industry during World War II was not an accident of abundance. It was leadership by design, a fusion of political vision and corporate command. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that wars are won long before the first shot is fired. In 1940, he summoned one of the nation's top industrial minds, William S. Knudsen, president of General Motors, to Washington. Roosevelt's instruction was simple but monumental. Me must out. Produce the world. Knudsen knew the factories, the labor networks, the engineers who could turn theory into reality. He brought with him the discipline of private industry, decentralization, speed, and accountability. Alongside Donald Nelson of Sears, who would later head the War Production Board, he designed an economy where government set the goals, but industry found the means. Their collaboration bridged the gap between bureaucracy and assembly line. Contracts were awarded not for profit, but for speed. Ford, Boeing, and Bethlehem Steel became extensions of national defense. Bureaucratic red tape was replaced with flexible command, military necessity dictating industrial rhythm. Roosevelt's fireside speeches turned production into patriotism. He didn't speak of tanks or bombers as machines. He spoke of them as guarantees of freedom. His voice reached the homes of welders and riveters, turning effort into duty. Even setbacks became lessons. When early tank designs proved unreliable, adjustments were made within weeks, not months. When rubber supplies fell due to Japanese conquests in Southeast Asia, scientists developed synthetic substitutes in record time. Roosevelt's leadership was not about dictating every detail, but empowering a system that could adapt faster than its enemies. It was strategic democracy, industrial self-correction at national scale, and while generals planned campaigns, factory managers and assembly supervisors became commanders of another front. One fought not with rifles, but with efficiency. For Japan, industrial power had always been admired, even envied. Yet its own path was constrained by geography and resources. The empire's military leaders believed that the American spirit was weak, that industrial comfort would make the nation slow to fight. Intelligence reports before the war described American factories as vast but soft, dependent on consumer markets. Japanese planners calculated that a surprise victory, like the destruction at Pearl Harbor, would cripple U.S. morale and production. They assumed the war would end before America could mobilize. But by late 1942, the reports from the front shattered that belief. From Guadalcanal to New Guinea, soldiers encountered American forces that seemed endlessly supplied. Tanks destroyed in one battle reappeared weeks later. Trucks, bulldozers, and artillery flowed like rivers from beachheads to jungle bases. Japanese soldiers began to speak of the Americans as kikaika, machine people. Not because of robots or weapons beyond understanding, but because of their relentless supply. A Marines tank platoon could be annihilated 1 month and reinforced the next. Damaged ships returned to battle within weeks, repaired in floating dry docks. Captured reports describe Japanese officers marveling at crates stamped with American factory names. Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago, cities thousands of miles apart, all producing parts that fit together seamlessly. For a nation built on craftsmanship and limited by scarce materials, this was incomprehensible. Japan's wartime tank production never exceeded 500 units per year, most of them light models. American factories built that number in less than a month. The psychological effect was profound. By 1944, imperial officers wrote privately that the war had become a contest of factories. One Japan could not win. Even as their soldiers fought with bravery and skill, they knew the outcome was being decided not on battlefields, but in assembly lines half a world away. Industrial might had become a weapon of the mind, one that broke morale long before armies met. The arsenal of democracy achieved what no dictatorship could: voluntary unity under moral purpose. Yet behind that triumph lay moral complexity. America's factories built freedom's armor, but they also created a new kind of war, one defined by mass production and mechanized destruction. Each tank, each bomber, represented human will converted into machinery. It raised questions that echoed long after the war ended. Was this the ultimate expression of human ingenuity, or its industrialization of death? For many workers, the answer came in the faces of returning soldiers. Survivors credited the machines that saved them: the tank that didn't break down, the jeep that got them to safety, the transport that arrived in time. To them, production was salvation. But to others, especially in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the line between defense and domination blurred. The same factories that built tanks could now build atomic bomb casings. The moral weight of that capability hung heavy over the post-war world. Still, historians agree, without that industrial mobilization, tyranny might have prevailed. The U.S. war machine became proof that democracy could match totalitarian efficiency, not through coercion, but through collective purpose. The moral lesson of that age was not just that factories could win wars, but that unity of purpose could turn ordinary labor into an extraordinary force. And that force, moral, mechanical, and human, would soon reach its defining test on the battlefields where production met resistance and the balance of the war would turn. The steel had been forged, the tanks assembled, the ships launched. Now, those machines were heading toward their proving ground, where the roar of industry would echo through the chaos of combat. By mid-1943, the full weight of American industry had crossed the oceans. What had begun as numbers on War Department charts now arrived as thunder. The rumble of engines and the hum of endless supply. The world began to feel the consequences of production without precedent. In the Pacific, that power first revealed itself on the beaches of Guadalcanal. When U.S. Marines landed in August 1942, they brought little armor, just light tanks and improvised vehicles. But within months, replacement convoys began to arrive. Liberty ships disgorged rows of Shermans, trucks, and bulldozers. What the Japanese had assumed would be a quick occupation became a grinding attrition they could not sustain. Reports from Imperial Army intelligence units told of American forces re-equipped faster than they could be destroyed. Every attack that damaged an airfield was answered by a new runway, rebuilt overnight with machines unloaded that morning. Tokyo intercepted radio messages, listing deliveries so vast they seemed inflated. 120, 5 tanks, 400 trucks, 12,000 drums of fuel. By 1943, the Allies had turned Guadalcanal into a fortress of logistics. American Seabees, construction battalions composed of civilian engineers and tradesmen, worked day and night operating cranes, graders, and transporters under enemy fire. Behind their lines, rows of tanks waited under camouflage nets, their olive holes glinting in the tropical sun. For the Japanese soldiers watching from the jungle ridges, the sight was disorienting. They fought bravely, often starving, while their enemies seemed to multiply endlessly. The conclusion reached by one captured officer was recorded later in an Allied report. What kill one, 10 appear. Their weapons never end. That imbalance spread outward like a tide. In North Africa, the same machine that powered Detroit supplied General Eisenhower's forces with unbroken momentum. When the U.S. Corps stumbled at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, the defeat was temporary, not because of tactics, but because of logistics. Replacement tanks and trucks arrived within weeks. By the time the Allies launched their final push against Axis forces in Tunisia, the Americans had more tanks than Germany could field on the entire front. The M4 Sherman, the workhorse of that machine, became the embodiment of industrial warfare. Crews joked that it was a factory on tracks. It wasn't the best tank technically, its armor thinner than a Tiger's, its gun less powerful, but it existed in overwhelming numbers. Where the enemy fielded one heavy tank, America sent 5. In the Pacific, Sherman's rolled off landing craft during the Tarawa invasion in November 1943, pushing through coral reefs under enemy fire. Their engines, built in Detroit, survived the salt water and heat that crippled earlier designs. Marines, once fighting with rifles and grenades, now advanced behind steel walls. Every battlefield became a mirror of American production. The U.S. Army's supply lines stretched like arteries across continents, trucks delivering food, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts with mechanical precision. Airfields in Australia stocked replacement engines in wooden crates stamped Packard Motor Works. In North Africa, tank crews received brand new engines shipped straight from Chrysler within weeks. This was the turning point invisible to many at the time. Not a single battle, but the moment when logistics itself became a weapon. America was fighting on industrial time. For Japan, the contrast was devastating. Its factories, already strained by Allied bombing, could not replace the losses from each campaign. Ships sunk at sea took with them not only men, but irreplaceable machines. The Imperial Army began salvaging wrecked vehicles for parts, a futile gesture against an opponent who treated tanks as consumables. By 1944, intelligence officers in Tokyo received reports from Saipan describing hundreds of enemy tanks landing each week. That figure was an exaggeration, but not by much. The U.S. Navy's logistical command had turned the Mariana Islands invasion into an industrial performance. Hundreds of ships, thousands of vehicles, all synchronized by planning born in American boardrooms years earlier. The world had never seen such scale. When a Japanese observer later wrote that the Americans fight with factories, it was not metaphor. It was truth. Their generals commanded not only divisions, but production quotas. A tank destroyed in combat could be replaced before its wreck cooled in the jungle. A plane shot down one morning might already have a successor rolling out of a Kansas assembly line that afternoon. This was the moment the war's outcome began to crystallize, not through speeches or ideology, but through math and metal. And that momentum, once started, could not be stopped. It would now surge toward 1944, toward Saipan, Lake Gulf, and Normandy, where the full industrial symphony of the United States would reach its crescendo. The year 1944 became the apex of America's industrial war. Across every ocean, the products of its factories converged: tanks, ships, aircraft, trucks, and munitions, forming a tide of steel that no Axis power could withstand. In the Pacific, that tide reached the beaches of Saipan in June 1944. The island was a fortress, Japan's inner defense line. Yet, when the invasion began, American naval gunfire and carrier aircraft cleared the beaches for an armada of landing craft. Behind them came the tanks. The M4 Shermans rolled ashore under fire, their engines roaring above the surf. Japanese defenders, crouched in bunkers and caves, watched through binoculars as the beach seemed to move. Machines advancing in formation, followed by bulldozers and supply trucks. Within days, those same bulldozers had carved airstrips out of coral and volcanic soil. The logistics machine worked in real time, steel plates, fuel drums, and ammunition boxes stacked in endless rows. Engineers built depots, even as shells fell around them. The Japanese command on Saipan reported to Tokyo, "Enemy reinforcement and resupply appear infinite." It wasn't infinite. It was industrial. For every American tank destroyed in combat, more waited aboard transports offshore. For every lost aircraft, another squadron was already flying from bases across the Pacific. The factories in Michigan and California worked around the clock, churning out the replacements. In Japan's headquarters, disbelief hardened into dread. Intercepted American broadcasts spoke openly of monthly tank production exceeding 2,000 units, figures that dwarfed Japan's annual output. Generals who had once mocked the soft Americans now called them the machine enemy. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the same miracle unfolded on the beaches of Normandy, June 6, 1944, D-Day. The greatest amphibious invasion in history was a logistical masterpiece built on American production. Every tank that rolled off the landing craft, every jeep that climbed the bluffs, was a direct descendant of the Detroit assembly lines. The M4 Shermans of the U.S. First Army pushed inland with uncanny reliability. Behind them came truck convoys, gasoline pipelines, mobile repair units. A battlefield sustained not by conquest, but by continuity. The Germans, who once prided themselves on precision engineering, could not keep pace. Their tanks were formidable, but slow to produce and maintain. The American system could lose 10 Shermans and replace them in weeks. Germany could lose one Tiger and wait months for its replacement. By July, as Allied forces broke through at St. L, American logistics moved faster than the front lines. The Red Ball Express, a truck convoy system stretching from Normandy to the Seine, delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers, raced across bombed roads, carrying fuel, ammunition, and food to an army that never ran out. On paper, this was a military campaign. In truth, it was an industrial procession. Every road was an assembly line extended across Europe. Every ship in the Channel was a conveyor belt of war. Every soldier carried a rifle stamped with the signature of a factory worker he'd never meet. This was the peak of the American machine, the moment when production, planning, and manpower fused into one unstoppable force. Even in the Pacific, where distances dwarfed Europe's, the same pattern repeated. The invasion of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 brought over 700 ships, including entire mobile docks and floating workshops. American tanks stormed ashore on islands thousands of miles from home, carrying spare parts and maintenance crews who could rebuild engines on the beach. The Japanese defenders fought with ferocity and honor, but their fate was already sealed. They had been left behind by a war that now moved at the speed of industry. One Japanese field officer wrote in his diary before the fall of the Philippines, "They have no fear of distance. Their factories reach across the ocean." When Tokyo received reports that American production lines were still accelerating, disbelief turned to resignation. Even as Allied bombers closed in on the Japanese home islands, factories in the U.S. continued breaking records, not slowing, not tiring. By early 1945, America had produced over 88,000 tanks, 324,000 aircraft, and 600 merchant ships. Each figure represented not just metal, but time. The compression of years of design and learning into relentless repetition. The moment had come when the outcome of the war was no longer in question. Only its cost remained. The factories that once symbolized hope now stood as the instruments of inevitability. Their roar had crossed the oceans, carried by convoys, echoed by guns, and heard even in the silence that followed Japan's eventual surrender. But before that silence, before Hiroshima, before peace, came the reckoning of exhaustion. Because while America's industrial might had conquered the war of production, the world was about to learn the human price of total mobilization. The smoke of victory was rising, but so too were questions about what that power had unleashed and what it would mean when the machines stopped. The guns fell silent in August 1945. Across the Pacific, the noise of industry, the endless pounding of steel, the hiss of molten metal, the hum of conveyor belts, slowly quieted. But its echo lingered in every ruined city, every harbor, every field where the machines of war had rolled. When Japan surrendered, it was not only a military collapse. It was the final admission that industrial capacity, the ability to build, move, and replace, had become the deciding weapon of modern war. The numbers told the story better than any declaration. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 86,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and 8,000 naval vessels. Japan, by contrast, produced fewer than 6,000 tanks in total, and only a fraction of that number in heavy vehicles. Its industrial base, once formidable, had been reduced to rubble by B-29 firebombing campaigns that turned Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo into oceans of ash. In those final months, Japanese officers walked through their own empty factories, steel skeletons without power, silent machine tools coated in dust. Many of them had seen the captured Shermans years earlier and dismissed them as curiosities. Now, they understood that the true weapon had never been the tank itself, but the system that made it by the thousands. When American occupation forces arrived, they brought not only soldiers, but engineers, administrators, and economists. They documented the scale of destruction and the efficiency that had achieved it. Japan's industrial output in 1945 had fallen to less than 10% of its pre-war capacity. General Douglas MacArthur's reports described the contrast with near awe. No war, he wrote, has ever been fought on so prodigious a scale of production. It is not the number of weapons, but the certainty of their renewal that broke the enemy's will. Even Germany's advanced engineering had not survived that certainty. Axis planners had calculated in tons of steel and barrels of oil, but the United States measured victory in hours of production time. In Washington, the War Production Board dissolved itself with quiet ceremony in late 1945. Its task completed, its records told a story of coordination unmatched in history. Every bullet traced to a factory, every factory to a city, every city to a worker. The human cost was vast. Over 400,000 Americans had died in the war, but millions more had labored behind the scenes. Workers who had turned ordinary labor into global power. For them, the victory was bittersweet. The machines they had built now stood idle. Assembly lines that once thundered with tanks now fell silent, their workers returning to homes changed by 4 years of relentless production. Yet the legacy of those years would not vanish. The same methods that had built Shermans and B-17s would soon fuel an era of prosperity. Wartime production had revolutionized automation, logistics, and management. The war had turned America into a technological superpower, one that would rebuild the very nations it had defeated. In Japan, the aftermath of destruction became a foundation for rebirth. American engineers helped reconstruct its industry, this time for peace. The same attention to efficiency and precision that once built war machines now built cars, radios, and ships for trade. Ironically, the Japanese engineers, who had once stared at a tank plate stamped Detroit Tank Arsenal, would later apply those lessons in reverse, building an industrial miracle of their own. But before that future could begin, the world had to reckon with what it had just witnessed, a demonstration that production could decide the fate of nations. The arsenal of democracy had proven invincible, yet its shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield. And in that shadow lay the beginnings of a new world, one still struggling to balance power with peace. In the months after the war, as Japan lay in ruins and Europe struggled to rise from its rubble, the factories of America faced a new question: what to do with all this power. The industrial machine that had produced tanks by the thousands could not simply stop. In 1945, plants that once turned out Shermans and aircraft began retooling again, not for war but for peace. Detroit resumed building cars. Boeing shifted from bombers to passenger planes. The same engineers who once studied armor thickness now designed washing machines, locomotives, and new city infrastructures. The momentum of wartime production carried the United States into an era of economic dominance. The tools of survival became the foundations of prosperity. Industrial logistics, perfected under the pressure of war, became the backbone of peacetime commerce. The highways that moved tanks would become interstates. The ports that shipped munitions would move global trade. But the moral and psychological imprint of that war economy endured. Many factory workers struggled with the silence that followed. The ceaseless rhythm of shifts, alarms, and production quotas had defined their lives for 4 years. Now, returning to ordinary work felt hollow. For some, the knowledge that their labor had destroyed cities half a world away was difficult to bear. Historians later called it the paradox of victory. The same system that had liberated Europe and crushed fascism had also revealed the new age of total war, one fought by economies, not armies. Japan, under Allied occupation, became both student and partner in this new order. American advisors guided its reconstruction, emphasizing efficiency, standardization, and education. Former Japanese industrialists studying American methods rebuilt factories with astonishing speed. By the 1950s, the names Toyota, Nissan, and Mitsubishi were once again appearing on ships and vehicles, now symbols of recovery, not conquest. Ironically, much of Japan's post-war industrial philosophy drew directly from the system that had defeated it. The principles of mass production, statistical control, and supply chain integration, perfected in wartime America, became the blueprints of Japan's economic miracle. Meanwhile, American veterans who had seen war firsthand returned home with stories that defied belief. Soldiers who once fought in jungles or deserts told of endless supply convoys, of tanks that seemed to appear from nowhere, of a war fought by machines that never seemed to run out. They, too, had witnessed the industrial miracle, not as an abstraction, but as salvation. One Marine, recalling the Pacific campaigns, later said in an interview, "We used to joke that if we broke a tank, Detroit would send another. It wasn't a joke. They did." The war's end also reshaped global strategy. Military leaders realized that future conflicts would depend on production speed and resource control. The Cold War that soon followed was, in many ways, an industrial arms race, a continuation of the same principle on a planetary scale. But the lesson that lingered deepest was psychological belief. The Japanese soldiers who had once stared in disbelief at American production reports were not alone. Even America's allies struggled to comprehend what had been achieved. Winston Churchill called it the miracle of the machine age. Soviet officials visiting Detroit in 1944 described it as industrial warfare perfected. And yet, for all its grandeur, the arsenal of democracy was built not on miracles, but on organization, on human hands, on discipline, and on faith that every part, no matter how small, mattered. By the time peace returned, America had proven that democracy could harness industry with the same unity as any dictatorship, but without surrendering its freedom. The war ended, the factories slowed, and the tanks rusted away in storage yards. But their memory and the shock they once caused in Tokyo warehouses endured. For those who saw it firsthand, the American industrial engine was not just a weapon. It was a revelation, proof that a nation of workers, engineers, and dreamers could, when called upon, build more than machines. They could build victory itself. The steel cooled. The machines stopped. Yet the world they shaped and the lessons they taught were only beginning to unfold. War has always been measured in lives, territory, and ideology. Yet the story of American production in World War II reminds us that it can also be measured in machines, numbers, and rhythm. The pulse of industry transformed into the pulse of battle. The tanks that astonished Japanese officers were not merely steel and rivets. They were the embodiment of a nation's capacity to organize, innovate, and endure. The significance of those thousands of Shermans rolling off the Detroit lines extends beyond victory. They illustrate a profound shift in warfare itself. In the past, skill and valor could tip the balance of a battle. By 1944, however, the scales had changed. The ability to produce faster than the enemy could destroy became as decisive as any strategy or general. Logistics, engineering, and industrial coordination became weapons as lethal as guns or bombs. There is a human lesson embedded in this story. Behind every tank was a worker. A woman welding a hole, a man tightening bolts, a team ensuring engines would run across oceans. Their labor carried soldiers into battle and sustained them through campaigns. It was a collective effort that married intellect, skill, and determination, proving that victory depends not only on courage in combat, but courage in industry. The psychological impact of this capability cannot be overstated. Japanese soldiers, confronting a seemingly endless wave of machines, recognized a new reality. The war was no longer a contest of individual heroism alone, but of nations mobilized to their full capacity. What they first called impossible became undeniable. Today, when we examine the legacy of the arsenal of democracy, it is not simply a story of tanks or numbers. It is a story of human ingenuity, of industrial power harnessed to purpose, and of the remarkable ways in which ordinary people in ordinary factories can shape the course of history. The Sherman tanks that rolled off those lines were more than vehicles. They were symbols of what a society could achieve when its people, its resources, and its ingenuity moved as one. And in that movement, the war was decided long before the first shots were fired, proving that in the modern era, production itself is a weapon, and the hands that build it are as crucial as the soldiers who wield it. Victory, in the end, was forged not only in battle, but in the unrelenting hum of machines, the sweat of laborers, and the certainty of an industrial will that could not be stopped.